Margaret Phelps was not the sort of woman whose name would be spoken loudly. In the streets of Black Hollow, hers was a presence that slipped quietly between the cracks of daily life, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it with any deliberate care. In the narrow, crooked lanes of that small Appalachian town in 1882, she could be seen from time to time walking at a steady pace, a wicker basket balanced on one arm, the hem of her dress brushing against the mud-packed road. The basket was always filled with folded cloth, rolls of thread, and small packets of pins, wrapped carefully in paper. She moved with a composure that was neither hurried nor lazy, the pace of someone accustomed to long hours, bent over a table, her hands busy, and her mind left to its own quiet wandering. Her home, a narrow wooden structure leaning slightly to one side, sat at the very edge of town, where the dirt road dissolved into a path leading up into the forested hills. From the outside, it looked as if a strong wind might knock it over, though those who had stepped inside described the space as tidy and precise as the woman herself. The single front room doubled as a workshop, lit by a narrow window that let in only a modest amount of sunlight. Against one wall stood a sturdy oak work table, worn smooth in the places where her elbows often rested, the wood darkened by years of use. Shelves lined with carefully stacked bolts of fabric linen, muslin, and the occasional piece of fine silk, gave the room its muted color, all pale grays, soft whites, and faded blues. Margaret's life was marked by a routine so steady it might have seemed mechanical to an outsider. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, light the stove, and boil water for tea. The sound of the fire crackling beneath the iron kettle was often the first sign she was awake. By the time the town's few shopkeepers began lifting their shutters for the day, she was already at her work table, the needle glinting between her fingers, the fabric pulled taut beneath her steady hand. She spoke very little while she worked, and when customers arrived, she would greet them politely, but without the warm, lingering chatter common in the town. Her reserved manner had led many in Black Hollow to describe her as distant. Though no one could say she was unkind, she simply seemed to prefer the company of her craft over that of people. She was unmarried, with no known suitors, and no family nearby. Her past, if anyone had the curiosity to ask, was met with the briefest of answers. She had come to Black Hollow some years before, renting the small wooden house with money she did not appear to earn from anywhere but her sewing. Where she had lived before remained a matter of speculation, and while some suspected she had been widowed young, others thought she had never been married at all. Her work, however, spoke for her in ways she never would. Every seam was exact, every stitch set in place with a care that bordered on devotion. A dress made by Margaret Phelps could last for decades, though in truth, few of her pieces saw much wear. Most of them were meant for the dead. This fact alone gave her an air of quiet strangeness in the minds of the townsfolk. Sewing burial clothes was not an uncommon practice in rural communities, but to specialize in it, to rarely be seen crafting garments for the living, suggested something different. There was no bitterness in her accepting such work. Indeed, she seemed to approach it with an almost sacred attentiveness. Children passing by her house on errands sometimes stopped at the window to watch her. They would see her leaning over the table, her head bent low, the needle moving in small, precise arcs. Her expression never changed much, though there was a softness in her gaze when her work was nearly finished, as if she were looking not at a dress, but at the person who would soon wear it, or rather be buried in it. These glimpses, fleeting as they were, fueled whispers among the more imaginative townsfolk. Some claimed she talked to the garments, murmuring as she worked. Others swore they had seen her sewing late into the night, the single oil lamp glowing in the window long after everyone else was asleep. Despite these murmurs, no one avoided her outright. In a place like Black Hollow, death came often enough that her skill was considered a necessary kindness, if not a morbid one. When someone passed, it was usually Margaret who was called upon to provide the final attire. She never refused, no matter the weather, no matter how late the hour. She would arrive at the grieving household with her basket, take the family's chosen fabric, and work quietly in the corner until the garment was finished. She asked no payment until after the funeral, and even then, Her prices were modest. Still, there was a subtle weight to her presence, as if she carried with her the silence of those who no longer breathed. Some swore they could feel a chill when she passed, though that might have been no more than the draft that swept down from the hills on certain days. Margaret herself gave no indication that she noticed such feelings in others. She walked the same steady path between her house, the homes of her clients, and the small churchyard at the edge of town, never lingering, never pausing to gossip or exchange pleasantries. It was this quiet constancy, the same measured steps, the same muted tones, the same unwavering gaze that made her part of the background of Black Hollow, as permanent and unremarkable as the hills themselves. And yet beneath that calm exterior, there was something in her life, some unspoken reason for the way she had chosen her trade that no one could quite reach. They would, in time, learn more than they wished to know. Margaret's reputation in Black Hollow was unusual, not because she was a seamstress, every town had one, but because of the kind of work she was most often asked to do. In larger cities, dressmakers earned their living with the steady hum of weddings, christenings, and the seasonal renewal of wardrobe. In Black Hollow, the demand for such finery was sporadic at best, and most households were content to mend old garments rather than commission new ones. Yet for Margaret, work seemed to come with regularity, though not from the joyous events that filled a dressmaker's book elsewhere. Her clientele, though small, arrived at her door with a single somber purpose. They needed clothing for the dead. It was not uncommon in rural communities of the late 19th century for families to make burial garments themselves, often from simple white linen stored away for just such a moment. But in Black Hollow, where winters were harsh and hands were often too calloused from farm work to manage fine sewing, the task fell to the one person with both the skill and the patience to do it properly. That person was Margaret Phelps. She did not advertise, nor did she need to. When a death occurred, word spread quickly, and almost as quickly came the quiet knock at her door. She received such visitors with a calm that could seem unnerving to those unused to grief. There was no fumbling for words, no awkward condolences delivered in a rush. Instead, she would stand in the doorway, listening, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her work basket. Once the necessary details were given, the size, the fabric, the manner of the deceased, she would nod once, as if sealing an unspoken agreement, and invite them in. There was a ritualistic feel to these exchanges, though no one had ever called it that aloud. The garments she made were rarely elaborate. Tradition dictated simplicity: a clean dress for a woman, a plain suit for a man, perhaps a ribbon or a lace collar if the family requested it. And yet her work had a quality that set it apart. The stitching was invisible to the eye, the seams pressed smooth, the fit exact without the need for alteration. Even those who cared little for clothing in life were given a final presentation that suggested dignity, respect, and perhaps something else, a kind of farewell only she could stitch into the cloth. Some customers brought her fabric from the family store, cloth that had been saved for years, sometimes decades. Others asked her to cut the garment from an existing dress or coat that had belonged to the deceased, reshaping it into something new for the final viewing. She handled each material as though it carried weight far beyond its fibers. A strip of worn flannel might be held for a long moment before she set scissors to it, her fingers tracing its frayed edge as though remembering something it had never known. There were whispers that she did more than so. A few claimed to have seen her press the finished garment to her face before folding it away, eyes closed as if listening for something. Others told of the faint sound of humming drifting from her open window at night, the tune unrecognizable but low and steady, like a lullaby sung to someone far away. Most dismissed these tales as the natural embellishments of small-town gossip. But even those who scoffed at such stories would admit that there was a certain gravity in receiving a garment from Margaret, as though she had sewn not only for the body, but for whatever came after. Over the years, her role in these moments of loss became quietly indispensable. The town's minister once remarked, in a private conversation overheard by a shopkeeper, that she performed a service as holy as any sermon. It was not meant for public ears, but it traveled quickly nonetheless. Some found the notion comforting. Others thought it strange to elevate a simple seamstress in such a way. Margaret, as always, seemed unaffected by the talk. She continued her work without alteration, without advertising, without even the hint of a smile or frown to betray whether she cared what anyone thought. In time, families stopped trying to make their own burial clothes altogether. When someone passed, there was no question who would be entrusted with the final attire. She became part of the rhythm of death in Black Hollow, her arrival at a grieving home, as expected as the tolling of the church bell. She would set up her small sewing kit in a corner, speaking little, her hands moving with a precision that gave the impression she was mending something far more fragile than fabric. It was in these quiet hours that the more observant among the mourners noticed something peculiar. Margaret never worked in complete silence. It wasn't conversation, and it wasn't song, but rather a kind of murmuring under her breath, a string of words too soft to make out, almost like the steady repetition of a prayer. If asked, she would only tilt her head slightly, as though she hadn't heard the question, and return to her stitching. Though the task was always solemn, there was one constant that unsettled some. She never seemed hurried, even when the funeral was imminent. She would finish at her own pace, fingers neither slowing nor speeding, as though the act itself existed outside the bounds of time, and yet she never missed a deadline. The garment was always ready when it was needed, and always perfect. What stood out most, however, was how infrequently she made clothing for the living. On rare occasions, a mother might ask her to alter a child's Sunday dress or mend a man's coat. But these requests were uncommon, and Margaret accepted them without enthusiasm. It was as if she had chosen her trade not for profit, but for a very specific purpose, one that the townsfolk preferred not to name. If there was any truth to the more superstitious stories, it lay in the way people spoke of her after the burial was over. Some families claimed to feel a strange peace once the deceased had been dressed in her work, as though a burden had lifted. Others spoke of vivid dreams in the nights that followed, dreams in which their lost loved ones appeared wearing the very garments Margaret had sewn, standing at the edge of a field, watching silently. Whether these were the imaginings of grief or something more, no one could say. In the end, Margaret never turned away a request for her services, no matter who came to her door, no matter how poor or distant their connection to her. She took the fabric, listened to the details, and returned the garment as if it had been waiting, unfinished, for her hands alone to complete. It was this quiet, steady work for the departed that bound her life so tightly to theirs and eventually made her one of them. Margaret's work kept her hands busy, but it was the quiet hours spent in her workshop that revealed the strangest side of her craft. Those who had reason to linger in her presence, a grieving widow waiting by the stove, a child sent to deliver fabric, sometimes caught the impression that Margaret was not sewing alone. The air in her small wooden home seemed to hold a stillness that was not quite silence, a weight that hung between the measured sound of the needle piercing cloth. It was in that space between stitch and breath that the whispers began. She did not speak to visitors much, yet when she was alone there were murmurs soft, almost imperceptible, as if she were conversing with someone who sat just beyond the edge of sight. At first those who noticed dismissed it as humming, but the longer they listened, the more it became clear that her lips were shaping words, not melody. No one could make them out. The syllables were swallowed by the closeness of the room. Still, the tone of her voice carried a quality that unsettled even the most pragmatic observer. It was not mournful, as one might expect, but calm and intimate, like the quiet assurance shared between two people who know each other well. The townsfolk's stories about these whispers grew with each telling. Some swore that she was addressing the garment as she worked, speaking to it as though it could hear her. Others, with a shiver in their voices, claimed she was speaking to the one who would wear it, not as they had been in life, but as they were now, cold and beyond breath. Even those who laughed at such notions found themselves lowering their voices when the topic arose. It was the sort of rumor that made you glance over your shoulder in an empty room. Margaret gave no outward sign that she knew people were talking. If she caught anyone watching her through the workshop window, she would lift her head briefly, her pale eyes fixed on them without irritation, but also without welcome. Then she would return to her stitching, the needle flashing faintly in the lamplight. Once or twice, someone claimed they had seen her pause mid-stitch, holding the garment up, as if to admire it or perhaps to show it to someone standing behind her, unseen. In the colder months, when the days were short and snow pressed up against the base of her house, she worked late into the night. The glow of her oil lamp spilled into the darkness, a beacon to anyone walking the road that led out of town. On those nights, the murmuring seemed to last longer, carrying on for hours after the last stitch had been placed. The fabric would be folded, the tools set aside, yet Margaret would remain seated at the table, speaking into the stillness. The words never rose above that soft private register, but the rhythm was steady, as if she were reciting something from memory. Fateful. What she heard in return, if anything, no one could guess. She never laughed during these exchanges, never wept. Her expression remained unchanged, her posture calm. And yet, more than one person who had glimpsed her through the frosted glass swore that the air in the room seemed to bend around her, the shadows leaning forward, as though drawn by her words. These were details that the sensible minds of Black Hollow refused to entertain for long. Still, the rumors persisted, carried like sparks on the breath of winter wind. There were those who argued that her murmuring was nothing more than habit, the mind's way of filling the quiet hours of solitary work. They pointed out that many seamstresses spoke to themselves while concentrating, but the defenders of this explanation always faltered when confronted with the oddest detail of all, her tone. It was not the distracted muttering of someone counting stitches. It was conversation, deliberate and measured, with pauses left open as though she was listening for a reply. Children dared each other to creep close to her window after dark, though few managed to get far before their nerve failed them. The ones who succeeded claimed to have seen something even stranger, the way Margaret sometimes laid a hand flat upon the garment as she whispered, almost like a benediction. One boy said he'd seen her fingers tremble for a moment as though a chill had passed through her before she continued sewing without a word. Whether these stories were born of truth or imagination, they became part of her legend in Black Hollow. The whispers were never loud enough to be understood, never captured clearly enough to be repeated, and that very absence gave them power. They belonged to the private world of Margaret Phelps, a world where she seemed to stand halfway between the living and the dead. No one knew what was said in those quiet conversations, but years later, when her own burial gown was found laid across her work table, more than one person remembered the strange stillness of her voice and wondered who had been listening all along. The change in Margaret's work was not something that announced itself all at once. It began so subtly that even those who relied on her most didn't notice it at first. For years, the garments she sewed for the departed had been plain by design, white or soft gray cloth. Simple cuts, nothing to draw the eye beyond the perfection of the stitching. But slowly, something new began to creep into her work. A hem might carry an unfamiliar looped pattern, so small it could be mistaken for decorative flourish. A cuff might bear a faint line of thread in a shade just darker than the fabric, forming a shape that seemed accidental until you looked twice. At first, these details escaped notice altogether, hidden in the grief-hazed days between a death and a burial. It was only when two families, weeks apart, remarked that the garments on their loved ones had been a little unusual that the quiet murmurs began. One widow spoke of a narrow row of triangles stitched along the neckline of her husband's burial shirt. A grieving father recalled a spiraling mark at the edge of his daughter's sleeve, unlike anything he'd seen before. These weren't embroidered flowers or monograms. They didn't resemble any known decorative style at all. The designs were too sharp, too deliberate, too strange. Margaret never explained them. When asked, she simply nodded, as though the comment had been expected, and went on about her work. If pressed, she might say it felt right, in the same steady voice she used to discuss thread thickness or fabric weight. There was no hint of defensiveness, no urgency to hide her choices. But neither did she invite discussion. The marks remained quiet and inexplicable, stitched into the very fabric of her reputation. Over time, the symbols grew bolder, Not larger in size, they were always small enough to avoid immediate notice, but more complex. A narrow chain of looping curves appeared at the hem of a burial gown, a pattern like interlocking hourglasses circled the wrist of a sleeve. They seemed to belong to no language the townsfolk knew, yet they carried a strange sense of intention, as if meant to say something just beyond the reach of understanding. It wasn't only the symbols that changed, her choice of materials began to shift as well. While she still used the white linens and pale muslins expected for burial closure, she would sometimes line the inside of a sleeve or collar with a darker fabric, one that wouldn't be visible once the garment was worn. No one could say why she did this. The dead had no need for linings, but those who noticed found themselves unsettled by the idea of something hidden so close to the body. There were other, more troubling changes. Some garments took her longer to complete, despite being simpler in design. Neighbors who passed her house at night noticed her lamp burning later than before, the silhouette of her bent form unmoving for long stretches of time, as though she were staring at the fabric instead of working on it. And when she did work, there were moments when her stitching slowed to a crawl, her needle pausing mid-air while she tilted her head slightly, listening as if waiting for someone to tell her the next step. The minister's wife, who had once spoken warmly of Margaret's skill, found herself unsettled after watching her work one winter afternoon. She had gone to deliver fabric for a neighbor's burial dress and stayed to keep her company while she sewed. At first, the conversation was sparse but polite. Then, without warning, Margaret's expression shifted not dramatically, but enough that the minister's wife noticed her eyes seemed focused on something very far away. The needle moved slowly, deliberately, each stitch placed with care that went beyond craft, almost like she was performing a ritual. When the minister's wife asked what the pattern was, Margaret only smiled faintly and said, "It's older than the cloth." She didn't elaborate. By the spring of that year, people were speaking more openly of their unease, though never in Margaret's presence. A few quietly requested garments without any extra detail, but most lacked the courage to dictate her methods. Whatever these symbols meant, if they meant anything at all, she seemed convinced they belonged there. The garments were still flawless in their construction, still delivered on time, still imbued with that same strange dignity she had always given the dead. But now there was something else woven into them, something the living could neither name nor understand. And whether the townsfolk wanted to admit it or not, that something made them feel as though Margaret was no longer sewing only for the dead. She was sewing with them. The night Margaret began her final commission arrived without warning, though in hindsight, the people of Black Hollow would insist there had been signs. The first snowfall of November had settled on the rooftops that morning, muffling the sounds of the town so that even the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer seemed far away. Margaret had not been seen in the marketplace for several days, which wasn't unusual, but a few neighbors noticed no smoke curling from her chimney in the early hours when she normally boiled her tea. By midday, the frost on her windows remained unbroken, as though she had not stirred inside. It was just before dusk when a faint light appeared in her front room. Passers-by saw her seated at her work table, shoulders slightly hunched, hands moving with their usual precision, but something about the scene was wrong, though no one could name it. At first, the basket beside her was not filled with the usual scraps and half-finished garments for clients. Instead, there was only a single piece of fabric, a length of white cotton laid carefully across the table. It was uncut, unmeasured. Yet Margaret worked with the slow certainty of someone who already knew every seam it would bear. There had been no knock on her door that day, no grieving family to bring her fabric or measurements. She had simply begun, without request, without payment, without any of the usual formalities. The needle glinted in the lamplight, dipping and rising in a rhythm that felt different from her usual work. Those who glimpsed her through the glass swore her movements were slower, more deliberate, as though she were holding each stitch in her mind before letting it pass into the cloth. By midnight, the snow had thickened and the street outside her home lay deserted. Still, her lamp burned. Those few who happened to pass a farmer returning late from the tavern, a young couple hurrying home before the storm worsened, described the same unsettling sight. Margaret bent over the white garment, whispering as she sewed. She did not look up when the wind rattled her shutters. She did not shift in her chair. The sound of her murmuring was too low to catch. But the steady rise and fall of her voice seemed to draw the watchers forward until they remembered themselves and hurried on. By morning, the storm had buried Black Hollow in silence. The town awoke to find her lamp still burning, pale against the dim winter light. No one could say for certain what drove them to her door: concern, curiosity, or the shared knowledge that something was being finished inside. The first knock went unanswered. The second, too. When the minister finally stepped inside, the room smelled faintly of candle wax and cold air. Margaret sat at her table, her head resting gently against her shoulder, as if she had drifted to sleep in the middle of her work. In her lap lay the finished garment, a burial gown, stitched with the same strange symbols that had marked her work in recent months. But this time, they ran in an unbroken chain from hem to the collar. The gown was sized perfectly for her own frame. The scissors rested at the edge of the table, their tips still touching the final thread. There was no sign of struggle, no expression of fear. Her eyes were closed, and her hands, though cold, were folded neatly over the gown as though she had been waiting for someone to take it from her. No one in Black Hollow had the heart to ask why she had made it, or for whom she'd been speaking the night before. But when they laid her in the earth 2 days later, she was dressed in the gown she had sewn for herself. And in that moment, even the most skeptical among them understood that Margaret Phelps had finished her last commission exactly as she had intended. When the snow finally let up and the church bells tolled for Margaret Phelps, the townsfolk gathered in the cold, their breath clouding in the air, the sound of boots crunching over packed drifts. Her passing had been quiet, so quiet that it felt almost rehearsed, as if she had been moving toward it for years without anyone realizing. But what lingered most in the minds of those who saw her in those last hours was not the stillness of her face or the way her hands had been folded, but the garment itself. The gown she had sewn was unlike any she had ever made, and not only because it was meant for her. It was a work of impossible precision. The white cotton seemed to catch light even under the gray winter sky, its texture soft but firm, each seam invisible, each fold perfectly aligned. Along the hem ran the strange looping symbols she'd been stitching into her work for months, but here they were uninterrupted, no breaks, no adjustments, no hesitation in the thread. The pattern climbed upward in deliberate spirals, narrowing as it reached the bodice, where it encircled her chest like a wreath. On the inside of the gown, unseen unless one knew to look, another set of markings had been sewn in darker thread. These were smaller, tighter, almost hidden between the lining and the outer cloth, as if they had been meant for her alone to feel. Those who had seen her in her workshop the night before recalled the faint murmur of her voice, but no one could say whether she'd been speaking to herself, to the gown, or to something that stood near her in the dark. Whatever her words had been, they seemed to have settled into the garment itself. When the women of the town dressed her for burial, they remarked on the uncanny way the fabric lay against her, as though it recognized the body it covered. The funeral was brief. Margaret had no family to speak for her, and no close friends to linger at her grave. The minister read the words of committal, his breath trembling in the frigid air, and the small group lowered her into the frozen earth. The gown's pristine whiteness was the last thing anyone saw before the soil covered her, the strange symbols vanishing into the darkness below. In the weeks that followed, life in Black Hollow returned to its quiet rhythm, though the absence of her lamp in the night was felt more keenly than anyone expected. Yet the strangeness did not end with her burial. A month later, a young seamstress, sorting through the few possessions Margaret had left a task taken on by the church, found several unfinished garments folded neatly in a wooden chest. Each bore the beginnings of the same spiraling symbols as if they were part of a set. None matched the measurements of any living townsfolk. The chest was kept closed after that, the garments left untouched. Some said Margaret had known her time was coming, that she had prepared her own passage in the only way she understood. Others whispered that she had not sewn her final gown for death, but for someone or something that had been waiting for her all along. Whether the symbols were a message, a prayer, or an invitation, no one could say. What they all agreed upon was this: when Margaret Phelps was laid in the ground, She was dressed in the finest work she had ever made, and she had made it only for herself.